Welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games, where we feed our people with relatable content, and our victory condition is your satisfaction. I'm Harry, and today we have another top 10 list for you all. Today I'm going to be sharing my top 10 stingy board games. And by stingy board games, I mean board games that are restrictive, constricting, board games that prevent, limit, and deter you from doing the things you want to do and accomplishing the things you want to accomplish. And quite often this is done in a very arbitrary way. But it's those very restrictions and finding ways to work around them and overcome them in order to accomplish your objectives and be as successful and as efficient as possible. It's that very challenge that makes these games so exciting, at least to me. So without any further ado, let's go straight into the list with my number 10. My number 10 stingy board game of all time is Shogun, designed by Dirk Henn. And this game takes place in a feudal Japanese setting where players are all controlling different shoguns, and these are actually historical figures in Japanese history, and they're trying to vie for control and influence and power over the land of Japan. The board consists of a map of Japan, and basically, primarily, this takes place through combat. This is an area control game where you take control of an area by resolving a conflict with one of your opponents, and the way the conflict takes place is very cool. It's very interesting. It's through a cube tower where you throw cubes inside each player that's involved in the battle, and not all the cubes come out. Some of them actually get stuck within the creases of the cube tower itself, and based on the majority, the cubes that has the most colors come out of that cube tower, that determines who is the winner, and they place those cubes onto their board because the cubes represent their units, their armies. But that's not necessarily the restrictive fashion, although there is a restriction there because you feel a little bit like you're not in control of your attack. Even with dice rolling, you have a higher probability or a higher way of gauging probability because you know it's a 1 out of 6 chance, or if you're doing a 8-sided dice or a 20-sided dice, you can do the math and kind of figure it out. With this, you kind of have to have a little bit of a memory element and kind of remember that you have a lot of cubes that are still stuck in your tower that may be pushed out later on and can help you in a future battle. But the true restriction in this game is through the use of the income. In this game, you have two forms of resources or currencies. You have your rice, which is food that you're going to need in order to feed people and what have you. But you're also going to need money. And your money is very important because your money is going to be used for an auction to determine turn order at the beginning of each round. And lots of your actions actually require for you to pay money in order to activate them. So you want to have money. And the way you generate income and rice with this game is by taxing the different regions that are under your control. However, the way this game limits that is because you can only tax each of those regions one time before you start to suffer consequences. Because every time you tax one of these regions, you place a little farmer's revolt token on that location that indicates that in future rounds for each farmer's token that's placed there, you're going to suffer the fight back or the pushback from the farmers. The game is divided into 6 rounds, 3 rounds in 2 different eras, and at the end of each era you're going to score, and you're also going to resolve farmers revolts. And the more repeatedly you choose to tax some of these regions, some of these locations, the greater likelihood that you're going to suffer some casualties when these farmers revolts, which can result in the loss of units or troops and can ultimately result in the loss of territories altogether, which will lose you points. So you got to factor all that in. Really, really cool game. I love everything that goes on with it, even the fact that every round you have to program your actions and you don't know necessarily what turn or what order they're going to be activated in. Even that makes this a very restrictive experience, and again, much of a challenge in order to just figure out how to be successful and as productive as possible. My number 10 stingiest board game of all time, Shogun. And now we move on to my number 9 stingy board game. And my number 9 stingy board game is Paperback. And this is a deck building game meets Scrabble. So you've got your typical deck building mechanisms. You start with a weak basic deck and you acquire or draft cards through purchase throughout the course of the game in order to strengthen that deck and ultimately get as many victory points as possible. However, the interesting thing about this game is that not every card in your hand is actually at your disposal in theory, because in order to actually activate not only the money that the cards in your hand generate, but also in order to activate any special powers that they might trigger, you actually need to utilize that card in the spelling of a word, because all of the words, all the cards in this game are letters. They are either single letters, vowels, or consonants. They are a combination of letters, and you could play them and try to make as many actual words that can be found in Webster's dictionary or in any other credible dictionary. And if you can use those letters to create a word, then you will score the money that they provide, which you could use to purchase more letter cards or purchase victory point cards. But you could also trigger whatever special actions, because lots of these cards have special actions. And obviously the more expensive, more valuable cards have more radically game-changing type of actions. But even some of the weaker actions can be very helpful in particular situations. But again, none of that matters if you cannot actually create a word with it. So sometimes you might find yourself with a really great hand as far as lots of money, lots of great actions. But if you cannot wrap your mind around those letters and decode it and transform it into an actual legitimate word, then it doesn't matter, and you're not going to get much done with it. So I find it to be really, really cool. The challenge of the deck building combined with the word building, I find it to be a really neat experience, at least for me personally. My number 9 stingy board game of all time, Paperback. And now we move on to my number 8. And my number 8 is Kingdom Builder, designed by Donald X. Vaccarino. And this game here, it's really cool because in many ways, this is a gateway game. It is so simple, so easy to learn. The rules are very basic. Even when you add the expansions, it doesn't really complicate things too much. And there's lots of great replayability here in this game because the variable setup is there's so many different options, so many combinations and permutations that you can find, not only of the modular board, but also the different scoring cards, because at the beginning of the game, you randomly select 3 different scoring cards, which will actually determine how you score in that game. So every game is played out differently because you do not necessarily score the same way from one game to another. So you don't necessarily want to implement a strategy that's worked for you in the past because it might not necessarily work for you in that current game. But the restriction in this game comes from the placement of your settlements, because basically on each turn, you're drawing one card, and that card has a terrain feature on it. And that means that you have to place your settlements, you get to place 3 settlements, onto tiles that match that terrain feature. And the challenge of this game is that if you can place your settlements adjacent to somewhere where you are on the board, then you must. That is the challenge of the game. So quite often that pressures and pushes you into situations where you would like to place those settlements into another location, another part of the board altogether, because perhaps it's going to get you victory points, because perhaps it's going to connect to a special location, which grants you a special bonus tile, which gives you additional actions and very interesting actions at that in future turns. Perhaps you want to do that, but you can't, because you have available spaces adjacent to you within those terrain features that you have to take care of first. But if you're very crafty and shrewd and very resourceful in where and how you place these settlements, then you can work a way around that, because perhaps you can place them in locations that have very few hexes of that particular terrain. That way you can fill them up quickly and then basically open up that terrain for you in future turns. It's a really cool game. It's one of those games where it's a few minutes to learn, but lifetime to master. I could always get behind that. My number 8 restrictive or stingy board game of all time, Kingdom Builder. And now we move on to my number 7 stingy board game of all time, and that is Notre, designed by Stefan Feld. And this game is a pretty ugly game. I mean, none of the games I've showed so far are necessarily lookers, but this is probably the ugliest one so far. And this takes place in medieval France, Notre Dame. Thematically speaking, it doesn't really mean much, but the cool thing about this game is it's essentially kind of like a worker placement, except you do a little bit of card drafting before you actually place your workers, which are represented by cubes. You do this card draft, where you have 3 action cards and all of your opponents around the table have 3 action cards. You pick one, it's pick and pass, and then you pass the rest to everybody, and you go all the way around until everybody has 3 cards, 3 action cards at their disposal. However, on your turn, you can only use 2 of those 3 action cards. But when you place the action card to trigger its action, you indicate the action by taking a cube, a color cube in your player color, and placing it on one of the sectors of your player board, because the board, it consists of each player's different section of Notre Dame or the surrounding villages, and basically each location or each board has 7 different sectors that you can trigger for their respective actions. But what's really cool is you put a cube there and then you trigger that location's action one time. However, in subsequent turns, if you can get a second, a third, and a 4th cube, then again, you get to trigger those actions a number of times equal to the amount of cubes you place there. However, you only start the game with a limited amount of cubes, so it's not like you can go infinitely. You start with like about 4 cubes, and there are ways of retrieving cubes from your general supply into your personal supply in order to have more cubes, but even that in and of itself is going to take a few actions to do so efficiently. So you're basically limited with your cubes, but even more so, you're limited because you have this play track that is messing with the players at the end of every round. And as that play track advances, you're trying to do certain actions throughout the game that mitigate it. You're trying to advance and progress your hospitals and your parks, because they're going to keep the contagion, they're going to keep the disease and the spread of that disease back. However, those are actions that could have been spent doing other things that would accrue points for you. And ultimately, at the end of the game, you can only hold back the plague for so long, because more often than not, you're gonna surpass the threshold on your plague track and you're gonna suffer the casualties. And the casualties are, you're gonna lose 2 victory points, and you're going to lose 1 cube or 1 influence in the sector in which you have the most influence. So you feel like you're starting to build momentum because you have 3 cubes in one location, maybe even 4, and then all of a sudden the play track passes the threshold. Guess what? You're going to lose that cube, and it's kind of like starting from scratch all over again. So again, it's very, very restrictive, but finding a way to try your best to hold back that plague as best as possible while still accomplishing your goals and scoring as much prestige or as much points as possible in order to win the game is a really cool and fun challenge. My number 7 stingy board game of all time, Notre Dame. My number 6 stingy board game of all time is Le Havre Inland Port, designed by Uwe Rosenberg. And this is basically the 2-player implementation of Le Havre, but it's actually implemented in a very much different way. As a matter of fact, philosophically speaking, these are 2 different games because Le Havre can be very generous, I would say. However, this game is stingy in many different ways. First of all, we have this dial that the players are manipulating throughout the game, and the dial serves 2 functions. First of all, the dial keeps track of what round we're in, which tells you how many actions the players have collectively, because that's kind of like the shtick of Le Havre. Basically, Le Havre has a odd number of actions that are distributed among all the players playing, and the player who goes first in the current round is going to have 1 more action that turn than the other players around them. Now, the restricted part of this board, the second thing this board does, is it keeps track of your buildings. Le Havre is all about city building. It's all about using your money in order to get buildings that generate more money for you, but also generate other resources that are going to help you build more buildings, like brick and wood and fish and grain. Those are the only 4 resources in this game. So you grab your building as soon as you build it, and you place it on your dial, and you place it on the 0 sector of your dial. And as the game progresses, you're rotating this dial counterclockwise to again indicate the change of round. And as you do so, you change this number here in the sector so that it's no longer a 0, it's a 2. The building that you just built the previous round is in the 2 sector. And that means that if you choose to use your building on that round, you're going to get to activate its ability 2 times. However, if you're a little patient and wait 1 more round, then you'll be able to trigger that building's abilities 3 times, because every time you use a building, you got to place it back in the 0 sector of your dial and start from scratch all over again. If you're a little bit more patient, then you're going to get 4 times that you get to use that action. But again, remember, just like in Le Havre, your opponents can pay you in order to use your buildings. So perhaps you're being patient thinking you're going to capitalize on it, but quite often it's going to be your opponent who pays you in order to use that building. Then if you wait even more, you'll get to trigger that action 4 times and get a 1 coin reward. Here's the thing, guys. If you wait too long, and again, you can't trigger all your buildings every turn, especially as the game progresses and you're accumulating lots of buildings. If you wait too long and the dial turns and it makes it here, then you have lost that building. You'll get half of the value of that building back in compensation, but the building's gone. You lost half of that money and you'll never be able to use that ability again. So again, that makes it restrictive in that regard. In regular Le Havre, you can use your actions or your buildings to your heart's content, and there's no restrictions in that regard. Now, the other very restrictive thing in this game is the warehouse that you use to keep track of your 4 resources. Instead of just accumulating a bunch of different tokens to represent your resources, you just have 1 token that you slide across this grid to indicate how much you have of that resource, and you find the intersection between the row and the column, and you add up those numbers, and that's how much you have of said resource. And as you play this game, this kind of becomes a game within the game, because when you manipulate this, there's only 3 ways you can move this. You move this to your left and to your right to indicate the loss of a resource or the addition of a resource. However, you always got to stop at the edges. You can never work your way from the edge of a board up to the next row or column. Instead, if you want to make progress upward, then you got to move just straight up in one spot to indicate that you gained 3 resources. If you want to indicate that you gained 4, then you would move up diagonally. But every once in a while, there is a challenge to the spatial manipulation here, this grid, that forces you to either A, not increase your resources as much as you would like to, or B, when you spend your resources for a particular action or for the purchase of a particular building, this forces you to overpay and you do not make change. So again, managing this to be as optimal and as efficient as possible, to not lose your money and to capitalize on as many opportunities to increase your wealth is a real cool challenge, but at the same time, very restrictive. My number 6 stingy board game of all time, Le Havre Inland Port. And now we move on to the top 5, the cream of the crop. And my number 5 stingy board game of all time is Azul Stained Glass. And just like the prior game, this game is a sequel of sorts and is basically quite the opposite of its predecessor, because Azul is the gateway game par excellence. So this game here basically has the same idea of Azul in the sense that you have these factories, these factory discs that are set up in the board that each have 4 different color-coded tiles that players are drafting from game to game. It's the same mechanism where you draft all of the color on one particular factory. You place all the ones you didn't pick in the middle or what have you. But the restriction of the game comes with the actual placement of those tiles, because while Azul had some restrictions, because obviously if you did not have the space for it, you could not place tiles down in your grid. But in this game, not only do you have the restrictions that come with the actual space, but the board here consists of all these different panels that, again, you're trying to match and place the colors that correspond with them here. Not only do you have that challenge, but as you move and place your tiles on these different panels of your grid, you have to move this little pawn piece that the game refers to as the glazier piece. And this piece moves alongside the column of different panels here and allows you to place your tiles onto that panel. Now, going forward, now that you've moved that glazier piece, you can only choose to place tiles that are to the right of that little pawn piece. Anything that's to the left is inaccessible for the time being. And again, every time you choose a certain panel, you've got to move that glazier piece towards the right to be right above that panel in order to place the tiles onto that panel. But eventually it gets to the point where you have a row or a column of eight different columns of these panels. And by the time you make it to the last one, that's it. That's the only one you could work with. Eventually it comes to the point where you're going to be obligated to skip your turn in order to move your glazier, your little pawn piece, all the way back to the leftmost panel. And that's going to be very frustrating, because you might look at the different factories and the different tiles available, and you might have something in mind, something that you wanted for yourself, but just guess what? You also know that one of your opponents might want it and have a vested interest in those tiles as well. and they're probably going to beat you to the punch because you're going to have to invest one whole turn in moving that glazier piece all the way back to the left. And I find that to be such a really cool and neat experience. Just find that little challenge of manipulating the situation and the timing as to when you want to work on particular panels makes this game, to me particularly, more interesting than its predecessor, Azul. My number 5 stingy board game of all time, Azul Stained Glass of Sintra. Now we move on to my number 4 stingy board game of all time, and my number 4 is The Pursuit of Happiness, the game of life for gamers. And this game here, basically players are role-playing and recreating their own lives or simulating their lives or trying to live a whole new life altogether. And it's really cool because players start the game with their childhood traits that kind of tell you their idiosyncrasies or their tendencies. And this gives them certain starting resources at the game and also a special unique player power throughout the game. Now, the interesting thing about this game is that it restricts you in so many ways because life can be very restricting. This game is so fun, so lighthearted, so silly in theme that you kind of forget how restrictive and stingy this game could be. First of all, the game, in theory, has 8 rounds. However, almost never do you make it to those 8 rounds because as the game progresses, you're going to be taking actions that accrue stress for you. And stress is detrimental. It's bad for your health and it lowers your lifespan and your life expectancy. So as the game progresses and you're taking these actions, you cross these certain thresholds on the stress track. And first of all, they limit how many actions you could take. The more stressed you are, the less actions you can take on your turn, because this is a worker placement game where you start with a base of 6 actions each turn, represented by these different sand timer pieces. But again, as you accrue stress or do other activities that are very time consuming, you're going to have less actions to work with in future rounds. But when we get to old age, the last 3 rounds are considered the old age rounds. Those ages are going to trigger certain stress levels in us. And as we increase our stress as a result of making it to those old age rounds, we're quite possibly and quite often we're going to die. And when you die, you are out of the game. It doesn't mean you lost. You can still be in contention for victory. However, you're not going to take any more actions for the rest of the game. You're going to watch the other players play around you. And very seldom does a player make it to the 8th round. It is very, very hard. You're going to have to take so many actions that kind of like reduce your stress and increase your health throughout the game. And there's only so many actions that actually provide that for you. But again, just trying to manipulate the situation as much as possible to try to live as long as possible is really, really cool. Also, you can have projects and you can have jobs and you can have significant others. But if you have too much of this going on, then you're going to accrue lots of stress. So you cannot keep on indefinitely gathering more projects. You kind of have to try your best to complete projects before moving on to another one, because if you don't, quite often that's going to add stress to you. So again, really, really cool, very restrictive, but it definitely makes me feel like I'm living a life. My number 4 stingy board game of all time, The Pursuit of Happiness. My number 3 stingy board game of all time is At the Gates of Loyang, designed by Uwe Rosenberg. And in this game, players basically take on the role of medieval Chinese merchants trying to plant and harvest crops in order to sell them to their customers at market. And it's very, very cool because throughout the game, you're drafting different cards that represent your customers. And you got 2 types of customers. You've got your casual customers and you've got your regular customers. And they both come with their advantages and disadvantages. The casual customers are going to pay you a little bit more, but they're going to ask for a little bit more. And also, they only have one-time commitment to you. Once you provide for them one time, they're going to move on from you. But at the same time, you don't have the stress of having to provide for them. But your regular customers, here's where the restriction in this game comes. Your regular customers, they're going to come to you 4 different times expecting you to turn in their crops to them, their food to them. However, if you ever go 2 turns in a row without providing them their quota, and it's usually a combination of 2 different crops or 2 different veggies, if you don't provide them their quota for 2 rounds in a row, you're going to face a casualty. You're going to have to pay 2 coins as a penalty, and those coins are hard to come by, and they're very, very valuable. So you don't want to overdo it as far as how many regular customers you have, because you might not be able to provide for them. And especially because the game kind of revs up. Early on, you only have one field and one crop to work with. But as the game progresses, you're planting new fields, acquiring new crops, planting and harvesting them as well. And again, that opens up the possibilities for how much you could do as far as selling to your customers is concerned. Also, the way you score is by advancing through this prosperity track. And it's really neat because the way you advance is your first advancement at any round only costs you 1 coin. But for every subsequent space that you want to advance during that turn, then you're going to have to pay the number equal to the printed value on that space. And this goes ascending all the way from 1 to 20. So as the game progresses, it's going to be very, very hard to ascend on this track. So sometimes you're going to feel like you're doing well, but it might not necessarily translate to this track right here. So timing as far as generating your money and knowing when and how far to advance in this prosperity track is very important. My number 3 stingy board game of all time, At the Gates of Loyang. My number 2 stingy board game of all time is Dominion by Donald X. Vaccarino. And this is the grandfather of the deck building genre, which is so popular and is found everywhere nowadays in the hobby. Now, Dominion here, quite often when I teach people Dominion and I taught them a deck builder before Dominion, they find this game to be so restrictive because in Dominion, typically speaking, you can only play 1 action card, and you have to play your action cards before you play your treasure cards. So again, there's a restriction even in the order and the sequence in which you do things. You gotta play your action cards. You can only play 1 action card unless you play action cards that grant you additional actions for that turn. So unless you actually invest in the drafting of those cards, quite often you're going to have turns that are very limited. And also, you have turns where you have 3 amazing action cards in your hand and none of them grant you additional actions. So you have the very difficult choice of picking which one of them you want to activate, and also the frustration of knowing that the other 2 are simply going to be discarded. Also, another restriction in this game is that no matter how much money you typically can only purchase 1 card per round. And in most deck builders, you have these massive, impressive, gigantic purchases that you can make because you accrued so much money, and all of a sudden you're buying 3, 4, 5 cards, and you're like, wow. In Dominion, that is so much harder and nearly impossible to do. Maybe you could purchase 2 or 3 depending on how cheap those cards are. But quite often you build this mega turn where you produce 10, 11, 12 coins, and you only have 1 buy, and it feels like money wasted, right? Unless you buy action cards, and again, it goes all back to those action cards, unless you buy action cards that grant you +1 buy or +2 buy or whatever it is. If you don't have action cards that grant you additional buys, then there is no way for you to purchase 2 things in 1 turn. And again, I love that challenge in this game. I love from the very beginning manipulating the situation, knowing I have a good balance of cards that give me additional actions, that give me additional buys in order to capitalize on all the other action and treasure cards that I'm going to be acquiring throughout the game. Great game, one of my all-time favorites. My number 2 stingy board game of all time, Dominion. And that's it. We move on to my number 1 stingy board game of all time. And I think this is probably the poster child of stingy board games. And how can it not be? And that is Agricola, designed by Uwe Rosenberg. And this is the 3rd game, I believe, in this list designed by Uwe Rosenberg. So I guess that's a thing for him, for some of his games at least. He does have lots of games that are very generous. But Agricola here is not that. This is a very stingy game. This is a worker placement game where players are building their farms, growing their families, breeding their livestock, planting and reaping their crops, all in the efforts to score as many victory points as possible. As the game progresses, you have 1 additional worker placement spot that becomes available to you. So that in and of itself adds a level of restriction because you don't have all the worker placement spots from the beginning. You kind of have to wait for certain things to even happen. For example, if you want to acquire pigs or cattle, they're not going to be available till way later down in the game. So early on, you could only invest in sheep. But along with all of that, there's the fact that at the end of every harvest round, and I think there's like 4 or 5 harvest rounds, you have to feed your people, and each member of your family is going to cost you 2 food tokens. Now, as you build your engine and acquire animals and acquire major improvements that have cooking utensils that you can use to convert those animals or your veggies into additional food tokens, as you accrue that, that becomes very helpful and makes you more optimal and more efficient in your feeding of your family. But early on, you're simply just trying to find a way to acquire food tokens. And again, that's just such a tough effort that you have to bypass perhaps a better action because you need to get some food in order to provide your family. But managing that, and again, trying to build that engine so you could do so efficiently later on in the game, is such a beautiful challenge. And also, finally, and this is the part that people complain the most about with Agricola, is that you're going to score in almost every category. However, most of these scoring categories have a cap. They have a limit. So that no matter how much you invest in them, it's worthless. It's not going to score you additional points. And that's something that people are bothered by, that they want to perhaps focus on building as many sheep as possible, but they can't, because once they cross 8 sheep, they're not going to score any more points for that. So it kind of forces you to play a more balanced game and focus a little bit in all these different areas. And again, I actually appreciate that challenge. But again, even though this game has its restrictions, it just speaks to me. I love the way it works. I love the story we're telling as we're playing, and I really kind of bring myself into this agricultural world as I'm sitting at the table. My number 1 stingy board game of all time is Agricola. And that's it for today's list, folks. Thank you so much for joining us. Comment down below. Tell me what you think about these games. Perhaps you disagree with the fact that they are stingy. Perhaps you disagree with the fact that stingy games have any appeal at all. I'm interested in reading what you guys have to say. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.